Tim, that's a gorgeous photo with you and your wife.
That was on our honeymoon, I must say. You know, now almost 40 years ago.
Wow, how appropriate that you were in front of a Hamamelis.
It's all part of Arnold's Promise, you know. It's that play on words of whenever we have our anniversary, I know that we're going to go out and enjoy witch hazels.
Oh, that's lovely. That's so wonderful. Every year for your anniversary, you have witch hazels, huh?
Pretty much. I made her an aficionado.
I bet. They are nice cut flower arrangements. All right, we'll just give them a few more minutes. It's only a minute in, and we've already got 94 people in here. That's pretty good.
On our honeymoon, we visited Christopher Lloyd at Great Dixter in England. And in his great room, he had an enormous branch of Hamamelis mollis from a tree that his father had planted. And it was there perfuming the whole room. And I turned to Christopher Lloyd and I said, you know, I think a mark of horticultural excellence is having the ability to cut a 4-foot stem and, you know, enhance your home and not detract from the quality of the plant that you cut it from. And he just smiled.
I mean, that must have been a pretty good size Hamamelis.
It was pretty good size.
Yeah.
Pretty good size. But he had a big room and a big vase, and it was just the right thing to do. Plus, he knew I liked witch hazels.
Right. And it was your honeymoon. So. All right, we got 101 folks in here. I think I'm going to give us just a couple more minutes. That's still pretty good.
Right now, they're looking at this screen. This is what they're seeing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's not a bad screen to look at. All right, so for those folks who are here, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself real quick. Okay. I'm Kim Shearer. I breed trees and shrubs at the Morton Arboretum, and I manage the Daniel P. Herther Charitable Trust New Plant Development Program. That's a whole mouthful. I have had the pleasure of being a member of IPPS since I was an undergraduate student. My first meeting was supported by IPPS Eastern Region with a scholarship to travel there. So that was yeah. And, you know, I got hooked that first time. That was in Louisville, Kentucky. I will never forget it. And so I've been a member ever since, because IPPS is filled with, Eastern Region is amazing. But, you know, I've also been a member of Western Region, and people, no matter what region you're in, you're going to find a good network of people to connect with and talk about your shared passions. So it's my pleasure to moderate for you today. Before we get started, I had just a few announcements to make. January was the start of our annual membership year, so right now is still a really great time to join IPPS Eastern Region if you have not already, or to renew your membership. I just did that in January. If you missed a previous micro meeting, you can now watch all first 7 of them. This is number 8. They're on demand through our website's video gallery, which can be found under the Media Center tab. Mark your calendars for the next micro meeting, which is going to be on March 10th. And more details will be posted soon. The IPPS Eastern Region Foundation is also, so the foundation is separate. The IPPS Eastern Region Foundation is still accepting applications for the internship funding program. Those applications are due March 1st. The grants are for up to $1,000, which is fantastic. And it can support housing, travel, wages, or educational expenses like conference or specific training related to the internship. And that will enhance the overall internship experience. I'll go ahead and include the link for the application in the chat box below once we get started. And of course, we're always taking donations for the foundation. I'll include the link for that website in the chat box as well. The foundation supports research and plant propagation, and also mentorship of internships. Mentorship of interns. There we go. That's a really, really great cause that I really encourage you to support for the future of the horticulture industry. Now, for a few final housekeeping notes, before I introduce Tim, please only post questions for Tim using the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. To the right of that is the chat button. You can use the chat box to communicate with IPPS staff or other attendees. This would be where you put any commentary about technical issues. All of your questions for Tim should just go in the Q&A box. Okay, now without further ado, I will introduce Tim Brotsman, President and General Manager of Brotsman Nursery, Inc., located in Madison, Ohio. And it is my pleasure to introduce Tim today. The first time I met Tim was at a MANTS conference a few years ago in your lovely, lovely trade booth that felt so cozy and welcoming and warm and inviting, I have to say. And I also bought my Bench Grafter's Handbook there. So Tim also sells Bench Grafter's Handbook if you want one of those, plugging that. Tim received a degree from the Ohio State University for horticulture and has had extensive horticultural experiences that have taken him around the world from Wisley, England to Tibet. So I want to hear stories about Tibet next. Tim's also served as president for the Eastern region, and as of 2021, you've been a member of IPPS Eastern region for 45 years. That's amazing. So I'm just going to go ahead and say thank you for all that you've done for the Eastern region. And thank you for this talk today.
Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Kim. Again, it is indeed a pleasure to be speaking to an IPPS gathering like this. So many IPPS people and others around the world have been my mentors helping my career. And, you know, today here in Madison, Ohio, we are probably at our 4th day in a row with a temperature high that's over 32 after having a month where we didn't go above freezing even one day. And in these last 4 days, the sun has been bright and shining brightly. Witch hazels have popped like crazy. There are about 6 of the mollis types that are already in full bloom, with many others that have been delayed that are ready to start. And so this is an appropriate time to do this program. Couldn't do it out of doors, obviously, because we had no way to do the video tech and the plants weren't cooperating. We surrounded the office full of witch hazels that are giving me at least the fragrance and some of the backdrop of witch hazels. I've been very fortunate in the last 45 years to know a lot of people who have shared their enthusiasm for witch hazels, their knowledge of witch hazels, and shared their plants with us. And for that, I'm ever grateful. I know many of you are listening today. And so to that, again, thank you so much for being part of this witch hazel history with us. And I have no doubt that one of the very first witch hazels I would have met back 45 years ago when I got out of school would have been Arnold Promise. So this program put together today is a bit to, I guess, if you pardon the play on words that it's obviously going to be, but this is a bit of my at least my appreciation of what Arnold promised me, if I can put it that way. Okay, so what is Arnold Promise? Obviously, Arnold Promise is a witch hazel, and that means it's a Hamamelis, and it means that it's a member of the Hamamelidaceae, which has 28 or 38 different genera that comprise it. And many of these genera are present in our landscapes, our home landscapes, as very common landscape components. One of those is fothergilla. 2 different species typically represent those very attractive ornamental shrubs, and we value them for their summer flowers, little spike-shaped flowers, and then, of course, autumn foliage be really, really nice on fothergilla. Another group of Hamamelidaceae that we use a lot in our landscapes here are the sweet gums, the liquid ambar. This particular plant in the background is variegata or aurea, a plant that has sort of an outrageous combination of pinks and greens and yellows all summer long. And then one of the more definitive ones that's come along more recently is slender silhouette, undoubtedly the most fastigious, most narrow-growing, hardy tree that we can produce here in Ohio. Rodia, Persica, the Persian Ironwood, is another member of the Hamamelidaceae that we can value in our landscape. Not as common as it should be, perhaps it's because up until recent years, we haven't had a lot of good access to the genetics and we haven't had the hardiness that we should. This particular plant the photo was taken at Arboretum Westpolar in Belgium. It's a plant that was originally introduced as Red Bull, but has now been changed to Red October, and it's from seed collected in Azerbaijan, which ought to give us a little bit hardier genetics than some of the plants that first came into this country via the Arnold Arboretum probably 100 years ago. Not all Protea are going to be this red in fall color. They're not going to be this broad spreading. Some are more upright, some are more yellow in fall color, but always we value the Protea Persica for a very attractive bark, multi-season plant because of this characteristic. Another plant that is very, very exciting and is pretty new on the scene is Protea subipalis, the Chinese Protea. This plant really wasn't classified as a Protea until perhaps in the 1990s. The first plants left China probably about 1998. On the left-hand side, you have Peter Del Tredici of the Arnold Arboretum, who's had the good fortune of actually visiting some of the wild stands, and there's only 6 known locations in China where this plant even is found naturally. Here's Peter, one of the mature trees. He brought back 2 seedlings. one of which is pictured on the right-hand side. This is a tree that's grown from what Peter collected in China. Its normal foliage is green. It has a transition into this fantastic color, absolute scarlet. Very easy to root from cuttings. It's been very, very hardy for us here in Northern Ohio. It's a great member of the Hamamelis and one that's destined, I'm sure, to take a very dominant role in our landscapes. Here again is a close-up of the foliage. It's an outrageous display of color, first-class plant. From Chris Bachtel at the Morton, I believe I got this photograph from Nanjing Botanic, where it has been used as a bonsai. This plant is on the red list. It's very endangered. It's in the red list, so there's not a whole lot of access to this plant coming out of China at this time. So what are witch hazels? Well, obviously, they're the subject of our program today. There are 5 to 7 species of witch hazels, depending on how you classify them. They're native to North America and in Asia. Charles Sprague Sargent, the director of the Arnold Arboretum in 1911, he basically summed it up saying that the different species really offer no great morphological characteristics to help you determine which species you're looking at. And that was sort of oversimplifying it because there are differences. Later, Mr. Chris Lane, in his authoritative work, Witch Hazels, published in 2005, went on to say that those distinctions are more or less determined by the geography and the habit and the habitat and the preference and the time of flowering. They're small, but they're distinct morphological differences. I like to see it in a little bit more down-to-earth sense of how I enjoy them out in the landscape. And that is, perhaps witch hazels are the only flowering shrubs in the Northern Hemisphere whose cheerful blooms frame both sides of our harshest season and have no peers in brightening the dullness of winter's retreat. Many of them are known, and this is unfortunately so, only to enthusiasts, thereby leaving witch hazels like a chorus line waiting off stage, poised to capture our hearts. And that's how I see them. As a group, witch hazels flower primarily in the autumn. They go into a holding period where nothing really happens in the middle of our harsh winter, and then beginning with days like today, even though our temperatures in the shade might be below freezing, the sun brings them out. And so it's a great harbinger of spring. It's a great, great plant to feature in the landscape to basically get us ready for spring. With all of these witch hazels now, 200 in total, I'm sure, of named cultivars, they have been sort of randomly chosen. There's been no vetting for, better or worse, but individually they have been developed because of the flower color or profusion, the flower size, fragrance, bloom time, plant habit, autumn color, leaf retention disease. We should have some factors in there as far as rootability, propagation ability. That really has not been part of anybody's introduction scheme. They have come out of the northern latitudes primarily, and the primary focus really has been Belgium and Germany. That's where the great epicenter of witch hazel development has occurred. Let's start with the one that's common here in eastern United States, Hamamelis virginiana, the common witch hazel. These photos illustrate typically it's a yellow flowering plant. It's going to flower in the autumn, and we find it as a small, medium-sized tree. It's native in the woodlands behind where I'm sitting right now. Normally October to December flowering, small yellow flowers. It's typically used as the grafting understock of choice, propagating materials, and it also is the source for the commercial liniment preparation. Hamamelis virginiana Ice Queen is a plant that I purchased seedlings from Harold Neubauer down in Tennessee. I believe the genetics of this plant reflect a southern provenance. And the reason I brought this up, because there's some fantastic new selections of virginiana that are flowering earlier in the autumn that are yellow. Harvest Moon from Dick James of Broken Arrow is one of the best. We have one now, Christmas Cheer, it's a new one. From I think Sun Glow from the National Arboretum is brand new. So there's quite a few new virginianas coming in. This particular one from Southern Genetics source, flowers very late in the witch hazel season. And actually it flowers so late that it crosses over and still remains in full bloom going into January. Depending on how harsh the winter is, those flowers may be there looking intact and looking very lovely all the way through January and into February. But typically they began to dehydrate by that time. We don't have very many dwarf witch hazels in the entire complex of things, but we do have one dwarf virginiana called Little Susie. Again, this came from Harold Neubauer down in Tennessee, named after his late wife. And it is highly floriferous, got a very large flower, very, very bold yellow, very floriferous. And the growth rate is diminutive. So it's one of the 2 true dwarfs we have in the witch hazel. The natural range of Virginiana, you're going to find some plants that are referred to as variety of rubescens. And unlike the typical yellow form, these rubescens have a tinted flower. Again, we have 5 choices going here at the nursery. One of them is an unnamed plant that came from Broken Arrow Nursery in Connecticut. We have another one that came, I think, from Brian Maynard in Rhode Island called Champlain Red. We have a third that's unnamed from Alan Jones at Manorview Farm in Maryland, unnamed at this time. We have this one, Mohonk Red, which is found in the Mohonk Indian Reservation up in New York State. I was told there were multiple plants. This happened to be one that was chosen and set out. And then the last one came from Mike Johnson at Somerville Nursery, Connecticut, referred to as Vincent's Red. All of these are different variations of the grouping that would typically be referred to as rubescens. It's a typical plant as far as your color for Virginiana. Many people don't know that these exist, but they do. When it comes to sequencing, I think of all of the early blooming plants, the earliest of all for me has been Mohonk Red. The rest of them follow shortly thereafter. Harvest Moon that I've mentioned as a yellow flower shortly after that. And then most of the Virginianas sort of fall into the line. But I think Mohonk Red is right here, the first one to bloom. There are a few variegated witch hazels. Actually, I think we have 5 variegated plants. 3 of them are Virginiana types. This one is called Green Thumb. Another that, again, if you like this kind of stuff, this is the kind of stuff you're going to like, but it's not my favorite. The lemon lime is a pretty bold, one of the more bold. The third one, a little product, recent. Here's another plant that came in this seed from down in Tennessee, which was purchased as Virginiana, but I'm quite sure that it is not. It has the stature of Virginiana, but it has the flower structure of a Vernalis. It has a glaucous underside of the leaf, which is a mark of Vernalis. The flowers very late in the season, which is more the mark of Virginiana, but it holds all the way through the winter. I went to look at our plant yesterday. It's still in bloom. It still almost looks this good. It's beginning to dehydrate a little bit, but remember, we've had a month of below freezing temperatures every day. It's still looking good. Very, very fragrant, and it does root easily. And so again, for a plant that fits that winter niche where nothing else is in bloom, this is one of those candidates because it is doing its thing. And the odd thing about it is, just recall the fact that now we have a hybrid grouping that normally isn't appreciated, and that is between Virginiana and Vernalis. Not very many plants are of that particular hybrid nature. Depending if you're a lumper or a splitter, the taxonomists are going to say if you're a splitter, you're going to create 2 species, Macrophylla and Mexicana. If you're a lumper, you're going to put them together and just say, hey, these are different forms of Virginiana. I can't be in either camp just because I'm not a taxonomist, but I would probably tend to agree that they're different varieties. That's not my expertise. Hamamelis vernalis, the vernal witch hazel, another native to the United States. In this particular case, we have a plant that is broad spreading, a thick suckering shrub, usually wider than tall, native down in our southwestern states and or down Missouri and Oklahoma, not really southwestern. The flowers are typically small. They're various colors from yellow through purple. They are very musty, very strong, fragrance as a rule, and they are typically autumn colors quite good, yellow, orange, or red. One of the things that happens with Vernalis is many nurseries continue to use it as an understock. This is either indifference or lack of respect for the problem that's created by grafting on Vernalis. And you're going to see further on as we explore this further propagation subject further why Vernalis is totally unacceptable as an understock. There are a number of selections of Vernalis in the trade today. Autumn Embers came from Roy Clem, and because of Roy's location up near the Wisconsin border, so northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, Roy and other nurserymen in his area preferred to look at the Vernalis types. Despite their southern origin, the Vernalis seem to be very, very hardy. I recall Ed Hazelkuss up in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, would not buy any intermediate types or Japonica or Mollis types. He wanted to have Virginianas or he wanted to have Vernalis because of their hardiness. And they're surprisingly hardy, and they're shorter of stature. They can have great fall colors. You see autumn embers here, and their flower colors we'll see in other pictures ranges from very clear yellow into some purples. Christmas cheer is an old cultivar, flowers at Christmas time. It's red, small flower, not overly attractive, but again, it's a midwinter bloomer that again, not many other plants were blooming at that time. Squib, I think squib is a British selection. Somebody may correct me on that. But squib plant, it carries its leaves into the winter. It's sort of tumbles all over the place. It's not a very tidy plant, a bit scruffy, I guess. But these small yellow flowers, which are just beginning to open right now at our place, have one of the most penetrating, intense clove-like scent of any witch hazel we know. We have nothing else that even smells like cloves. And this plant here, when it comes down to plants for fragrance, have this someplace maybe out of sight, but have it someplace where that scent will slip out. It'll catch a visit to the garden, and they'll want to go out there and find out where this plant is. This is a very penetrating, powerful scent. So that's squib. Cranky Red was developed locally of the Vernalis selection, and it has good autumn color. It does root from cuttings. It does retain its leaves in the fall, which again is a negative for most all witch hazels who retain their leaves and then have that leaf retention, flowering. But Cohanky Red does age into a lovely lavender shade. Now, there are a couple of weeping witch hazels in the trade, and here at Arboretum camped out is Chris Saunders, a great witch hazel enthusiast from England, and he's visiting Arboretum camped out, and he is standing next to another sort of untidy plant, and that's Lombard's weeping. Here's a picture of Lombard's at the Dutch flower show, showing how it's staked up, and it does have a weeping trait. But other than the fact that it's pretty good at covering the ground and scrambling all over the place, might be a good cover for rabbits, I guess. But it is a bit of an untidy plant, and again, it's not commonly grown, but it is a pretty attractive plant when it's trained up. Another dwarf, this is actually the other dwarf that currently exists in the witch hazel cadre, is Hamamelis Vernalis Quasimodo. It's, again, just a dwarf, compact native plant for us. And again, in the United States, natives are becoming quite the buzzword. So we have a native plant, a North American native plant that is compact, grows slowly, is rootable from cuttings, and it does flower quite well. The flower color is not exciting, but it definitely serves a purpose as a dwarf. Now, one of the more exciting plants that has come down the pike in recent years is this one from the late Jim Zampini. Jim had Lake County Nursery, and 7 years ago, he brought me two plants, what he called burnt mahogany, which has maroon new growth, and it's sort of a big untidy grow in a sense, but has great fall color. But the one that I really like is Golden Eclipse. And the Golden Eclipse is, well, you see it right here. The late summer color, the early autumn color is very intense. I don't know of any other witch hazel that produces these types of shades. It is rootable, and that's a great plus because we can produce this from cuttings. I think in time, this plant's going to have a lot more positive role, a lot more value in the landscape as people get to know this plant. Right now, as far as I know, Lake County Nursery controls the proprietary rights to this tree. I asked them recently how many people they have licensed to propagate it, how many people even have it, and apparently we're the only one. For whatever reason, no one else has been licensed to propagate it. So anything that's out in the trade today has come through us, and it's very unfortunate, and I would hope that situation changes in the future. Hamamelis ovalis, that's pretty exciting because in the case of Hamamelis ovalis, excuse me, this plant was discovered in 2005. And how can you have a woody plant that has very distinct characteristics growing in the United States, discovered in 2005? It's remarkable that that was the case. The characteristics of the plant are there a small tree, a small tree, or we have seen a thick mat that in the case of the example, the only example I've seen of this was roughly 18 inches high to knee high and 12 feet across. That was it. It had no arboreal portions that were above that height. Yet we saw plants elsewhere there and in other states were 15 feet. So that was quite a remarkable dichotomy to see, basically. We had trees that were tall and we had some that were mat forming. It has the ability to run and colonize the root system, and thereby it has the name running root system. It is not yet widespread in cultivation. It has no known cultivars that we're aware of, and it has not been used in hybridizing to any extent to this point. Now, the story of Ovalis begins with the man on the left, Mr. Steve Leonard. In Mississippi, down by Hattiesburg, Mississippi, it's a property that's the DeSoto National Forest, and it's owned, or it's actually leased to the Army, the U.S. Army, for a training base. They have a place called Camp Shelby. And along the side of their tank training facility They wanted to expand the safety zone. And so they called in the Nature Conservancy to see what sort of environmental impact they would have if they expanded this tank activity zone. And Steve Leonard went in there and he found a witch hazel species, or found witch hazel plants, and he knew were witch hazels, but he had no clue what they were. They didn't quite fit the Virginiana or Virginiana, which can grow there, and they shouldn't be Vernalis because Vernalis doesn't grow in that part of the country. So he sent the plants, as I recall, to the Missouri Botanic Garden. They got back to Steve and he said, you know something, you've discovered something that's not on record. You have a new species of witch hazel. So he had the honor of naming it. Running witch hazel was the name he chose because of the fact that they did decent run, and it became a plant of record. Chris Lane heard about that plant, and eventually the U.S. Forest Service contacted me and asked if I'd go down there and propagate it because only 3 or 4 known populations on this property had been discovered. So it could be very endangered, it's a very limited distribution. They wanted it propagated. To achieve that, I turned to my good friend and ally in plant propagation, is Harold Neubauer, the guy in the middle. Harold is a German-trained nurseryman of great renown. Anything that's special that I have propagated, I always turn to Harold. So he and I went down there, we met Steve, and we collected a bunch of cuttings, and away we went. We got this thing underway. What was interesting about being down at Camp Shelby, and we were cautioned constantly because of the fact that it was an artillery range, was we were not supposed to stray out of the area where Steve said we were limited to go. And just said, you know, you don't know where the unexploded ordnance is laying out here in this woods, so make sure you stay exactly where I tell you to go. So we had to do that. That was fun. And here's a picture we took of the running witch hazel that was more prostrate, more matte form. Now, there may be some reason why this looks like this, some sort of contrived reason. This area does get burnt periodically, but we couldn't find any remnants of more arboreal portions. This piece did not seem to have been burnt recently. So we are hoping that this represents a fixed form, fixed morphological form where it's going to be running and not arboreal. Just imagine if that indeed proves to be true, having witch hazels that are low, knee-high plants, bred for flowering traits, it could be very enhancing. It could be a lot of fun if indeed this form proves to be true. Now, in 2009, later in 2009, after Chris Lane's, after it was published that Steve Leonard these plants over in Mississippi, the guy on the right here, Wayne Webb, who's a forester in Alabama, realized that for the previous 10 years, he'd been tromping on the forests of Alabama, and he'd been seeing this same species as well, but he did not know that it was what it was turned out to be. So he reached out to Chris, and Chris reached out to us again, and down we went again, this time to collect plants in Alabama. Unfortunately, in both collecting opportunities, we never really got a chance to see what do the flowers of this species look like. How much representation of color range do we have to work with? We did see multiple forms of leaves. Leaves are, in this case, fairly broad for their length. They're sort of pubescent on the back side, and that's where the name ovalis came from, because it has a broad leaf. But that wasn't typically, when we got down there and actually looked at the plants, we found many that had much more narrow leaves. They weren't very oval at all. The thing that was exciting as more people began to study these plants were the photographs. Here is a picture of a very beautiful red plant that was taken down at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. There's another photograph taken in Camp Shelby of a bicolor form. From Rick Lewandowski over in East Texas, I received this photograph of the plants that he's been collecting in East Texas. And I should mention that so far, this species has a very narrow latitude that it's been found across the southern part of the United States. And I believe from the northern part of Florida across to the eastern part of Texas, it's been found in every state except, I think, Louisiana. I think that's correct. But anyway, this is the kind of flower colors that Rick is finding in just one part of its range in each Texas. From Rick, I also received this photograph this year of a pink form, of which I had never seen a witch hazel that began its color in pink. Some plants, as they age and senesce, they become this kind of lavender shade, but this is a pink form that Rick said is not uncommon in eastern Texas. From Jared Barnes, I received this photograph, again in eastern Texas, of an ant carrying a and though it's hard to see, here's this ant carrying off a petal of Hamamelis ovalis. So this sort of begs the question, which somebody may ask later on, well, what are the pollinators of these plants? Certainly here in the north, ants aren't the pollinators. Those babies are still asleep down on the ground this time of year. But down in Texas, maybe ants are part of the pollination scheme. I don't know. So now we go to Hamamelis mollis, the Chinese witch hazel. Hamamelis mollis are almost consistently some shade of yellow, and a bit of orange might creep in, but they're consistently yellow. They are large shrubs to small trees. They're multi-stem, Central China natives. Flowers a little bit. Probably the largest flowers in all the Hamamelis are represented by the mollis types. They are fragrant in March. Out today, we have about 5 different mollis that are in full bloom today. They are the early ones that should have been in bloom prior to now. The intermediaries are just beginning, some of the early intermediaries are just beginning, and none of the japonica types are in fall for us. So today, of the 10 plants that are coming into bloom and the 5 that are in bloom, everything that's in full bloom today is a mollis type. So they're the early ones for us. The leaves are large, they're rounded, they're hairy, they have yellow fall color as a rule, and a notation here, all witch hazels prefer a well-drained, rich, deep soil, and they are subject to drought. Now, this picture was taken by Carla Toina from the Leiden Botanic Garden. Carla sent me this photograph after a visit to China where she saw Hamamelis mollis in the wild. Clearly, this particular plant is a great specimen as far as quite old and probably quite stressed, because this is where she took the photograph. My gosh, what a tough terrain. It's somewhere within this complex of mountains. Carla saw the Hamamelis. And then here's Hamamelis mollis as found in commercial settings, where we have found improvements as far as the size of the flower and the floriferousness and all that. But Hamamelis mollis is native to China, and I gather for regions similar to this. It was mentioned before the start of the show that my wife and I had a December wedding. We honeymooned back in England, and we joined up with our good friend Martin Ricks at Kew Gardens and were able to enjoy witch hazels. But my wife, who'd probably never seen a witch hazel in her life, she's a native of Honduras and had not seen witch hazels until she came to Ohio, really had no experience of them until she came to visit England and see the magnificent plants at places like Kew. And now she's a witch hazel aficionado. And so I guess part of the Arnold Promise message to me is whenever I think of our anniversary or whatever I think of witch hazels in season, I think of that dualism. We were married and we honeymooned during witch hazel time. It's sort of a great memory. Hamamelis mollis and Rhododendron carnulatum, again, 2 very early blooming species in side-by-side posture here. I think this was taken in England, but again, just a good juxtapositioning of 2 very early choice plants. Hamamelis japonica, the Japanese witch hazel, the other Asian species. And in this particular case, you can see some colorations up in the corners. We have some reddish tints. We have actually more of an orange red on the right-hand side. And this particular plant is similar to mollis, except it does differ in that it's a bit taller plant, oftentimes developing a much flatter top. It's native to Japan, where there are many different forms, both in leaf formation and in the color range of the flowers. The flowers are a little bit smaller than on mollis. They're crinkled, they're yellow to red, they're often bicolored. They're not as fragrant as mollis. The leaves are smaller, they're more angular than mollis. The fall color is variable. It can be yellow, it can be orange. Well, here's an example of Hamamelis japonica that is yellow. This particular form represents how the flowers are not as flat, they're not quite as straight, they're more crinkled and they're twisted. And again, looking up into a plant like you see on the right-hand side, sort of a star-like appearance. I find it's the flower texture, the habit of the flower is much different than mollis, and it's very, very beautiful. It's very different. From Mikanori Agasu in Japan came this particular plant, Hamamelis japonica variety obtusata. It had very simple flowers. It wasn't heavily profuse, but its flowers were very simple, very star-like. I found it one of the most attractive of all the wild representations of witch hazel that we have. The fall color was very bold, very clear yellow. Again, I like this plant a lot. In 2015, by a freeze event that I'll get to later on in this program, and unfortunately, I've lost this plant, and I need to reintroduce it. Weeping forms, we talked about Lombard sweeping, was more of a sprawler. The Japanese witch hazel does have a weeping equivalent. It's called Japonica pendula or falling stars. The plant on the left, or plants on the left, are from a Dutch flower show where they're trained up and the weepy characteristic will develop. What on the right's in a container. They want to just go up and bend over. The problem with this plant was we had enormous sensitivity to anthracnose, and in the field, I was unable to keep this plant alive. After 2 or 3 years, the stock plants perished. I've never reestablished it again because I have not initiated any type of a program to try to control any disease in the stock. So now we're going to go over to Hamamelis intermediate. And so what is Hamamelis intermediate? Well, anytime you have a combination of the Japanese and the Chinese, so mollis with japonica, whether or not it's a 50-50 cross or it's some back crossing and some mix of proportions, no matter what it is, if those two bloodlines are the exclusive bloodlines in the plant we're talking about, then it's appropriate to refer to that plant as Hamamelis intermedia. If it involves Vernalis or involves Vernalis or any other species combination, then we cannot legitimately refer to that plant as an intermedia. That is because to have a specific designation such as intermedia, it has to be written up and published in a appropriate journal. And then once that has been done, then that name can be utilized. So far, there has been no other type of hybrid description written up and published. So we only have intermedia, and we can only use it for combinations of those two. So how did intermediate come about? In 1928, William Judd, the propagator at the Arnold Arboretum at the time, collected seeds from a plant of Hamamelis mollis. The parent had been grown from seeds collected by Wilson in China in 1905. The resulting seedlings turned out to be hybrids, and Alfred Rader in 1944 named the hybrids after describing the crop, describing those characteristics. He named that, he coined the name, and it was accepted as Hamamelis intermediate. In 1963, the most outstanding of the 7 hybrid seedlings was given the cultivar name of Arnold Promise. Not Arnold's Promise, but Arnold Promise. And when it was removed in 1992 at the age of 64, it had reached a height of 30 feet. Now, these dimensions suggest the feature that Arnold Promise possesses, and that is its mature shape, its overall form is upright vase. It is not broad spreading, it's not rounded as so many will be. It's going to be an upright vase. And so Arnold Promise was probably the very first of any American cultivar to be named and introduced into the trade. But at the same time this was happening in Massachusetts at the Arnold, things were going on back in Belgium, especially at the nursery of Mr. Anton Court in the community of Amtel. And Court had, I think he was born in 1895 and he died in 51. And at his nursery, he was raising witch hazels, and it is assumed that he was using Hamamelis japonica variety Flavopurpurescens, plant on the left, as his seed parent. As far as the pollination parent, there were mollis there may have been other intermediates, there may have been other japonicas. I really don't know that history well, but it is assumed that he was japonica Flavopurpurescens. He began to establish seedlings in his garden nursery. His properties were badly beat up in World War I and World War II. He died shortly after World War I. His property was in disarray. And at that time, the property was bought by 2 brothers, Robert and George, to restore the nursery and the garden and create a home for themselves and a bit of a training facility for young horticulturists. This really took up a head of steam when Robert married Yelena, and together they created Arboretum Comtout, and its legacy lives on today as the epicenter of the witch hazel development and documentation. But in time, the builders turned the property of Comtout over to the city of Antwerp, and they bought another property some miles away, and they've started Arboretum Hamamelis there. And there at Hamamelis, they sowed perhaps thousands, certainly hundreds, if not thousands, seedlings of Hamamelis, and a great number of cultivars were chosen there and perhaps are still being selected there and evaluated. So here's Madame de Belder at Hamamelis, out in the collections with witch hazel. And then in this photograph, again, she's at Hamamelis and she's with Mikanori Agisu, a young Japanese botanist who today is one of his country's leading botanists. He told me once he's made 50 discoveries of new species and forms in China, where he really specialized in study. But Mikanori is one of these young people who passed through the environs of Hamamelis and Comtout, became good friends with the de Belders, and has left his impact on horticulture all those years after that. The witch hazels now are being promoted out of the United States, especially out of England and Germany. There's research being done in Denmark as well. And so there's a lot of witch hazels now getting a foothold into our ornamental landscapes. And of course, this picture was taken in England, where there's almost nothing that can rival witch hazel for its winter beauty. But in the United States as well, witch hazels are showing up. They're being, in the northern landscape at least, the only plant we have that can really add a floral interest. And they can take the cold, obviously. They can weather it all. And here's an example of a plant. This was Anton Court in our nursery here under an ice field. And this plant here, as soon as that ice would melt off, as long as we didn't have a dehydration of wind coming in after the fact, this plant's going to just basically unfurl itself. It's going to be good again, and it's going to be right back where it should be as soon as this ice melts off. But this suggests a tolerance. Really, we can't just say it's absolutely tolerant, because we had an event here in 2015 that was devastating. Hamamelis on many, many species annihilated, because in that third week of February, roughly the 21st of February 2015, our temperatures here dropped from 24 to 30 below 0 Fahrenheit, which is shown here, 31 to 34 centigrade. We had more than 80 selections of Hamamelis in this particular stock block. Half of them were killed to the ground, including plants that were 30 years of age. What an unfortunate, after all those years of study and assembly, to have these plants just slammed by one event was just a tragedy. I was hoping to find some way to look at this cold event, though, and say, okay, which of these varieties are the hardiest? Which species represents the hardiest bloodline? But because the death was so absolute, there was very little transition and no ability to really say this variety is better than another. My gut feeling, if you were to ask me, would be to say that Japonica is less hardy than mollis. But I don't know that could be argued both ways, depending on where you're from and your own observations. But I think that in our case here, plants that were 30-year-old plants of Japonica rubra and Flavopurpurescens were slammed to the ground. My big mollis were in that phase. They might have some dieback, but they were not. So anyway, I think that this example was a big setback for us. We're in the process of rebuilding our collection to restore to what it used to be. But talking about cold, and I bring this picture of Forsythia in because one of the problems we have here in the Northeast, and we certainly will not have it in Europe, is that we can have a lot of snow cover, and this line right here represents where the snow cover on this Forsythia was. And then we can have a line here that represents a zone where there's no floral buds that are alive. And my thoughts on this matter is that particularly right now, this very month of February, when we have increasing day length, we have snow cover typically on the ground, our nights can be well below freezing, and we end up with the sun at a particular inclination where the reflected light is very intense, it generates a lot of heat, and as a result, these buds, which are beginning to swell as they lose their dormancy, their hardiness, these buds are fried. So we have a zone, and the Forsythia represents this very well, but we see this oftentimes in our witch hazels, where there's a zone between the snow line and some reflective limit to the height the flower buds produce. So my friend Phil King suggested, why don't you plant the epimediums or Pactysandra Bucum or something under those plants or under your witch hazels so you don't get that reflected light? Well, those are great companion plants for witch hazels, no doubt about it. But the problem is mostly the snow cover will be deeper than the height of those particular plants, and so we're still going to get reflection. So I think if you're dealing in a landscape situation where reflected snow could be an issue, reflected light, excuse me, off the snow is an issue, and you are prepared to do an understory planting, try to put in something that's going to give you some height up to maybe 24, 30 inches, something that will trap the snow and yet not allow the snow to pile on top and the light then reflect off. So getting back now then to the influx of cultivars, no vetting going on as far as what is the better one, which should be grown in a particular area, just what knowledge do we have about witch hazels in general. It's pretty new stuff. When I was in college 50 years ago, we learned about the species, we learned about a couple of plants coming out of Belgium. That was it. There was virtually no discussion about any of the cultivars because they didn't really exist 50 years ago. So now we go back to Camped Out, back to Madame de Belder, and we introduce ourselves to a man named Chris Lane. There's Chris, the Yellen of the Belder, and obviously the association with Camped Out and the Belders and the European sources, witch hazels in general, led Chris to put in an incredible effort of several years of work, cooperating with Timber Press and the Royal Horticultural Society. He created the standalone book on witch hazels, which is unfortunately out right now needing revision, but this is Chris's book called The Witch Hazels. And in his book, he began to explore not just the A to Z of all the cultivars that he could record, but how to grow them, how to use them, and all those other details that go along with having a complete guide and representation of a very unique group of plants. And so I've used this picture, and again, the propagators out there are probably just sort of cringing as they look at this graph union. But for those who really don't know the propagation methodology, grafting is the way that we typically produce our witch hazels. And here, starting at this point, we have a scion, which is representing the plant we want to propagate. And down below, we have a rootstock of something that's compatible for a witch hazel. And uniting these two together in the greenhouse, in the field, we create a union. And this particular union is actually of a magnolia, not of a witch hazel. But I wanted to pick a union that had some exaggeration. Again, what we're trying to do is connect two bits of different plants that are going to be compatible and grow on to become the useful and desirable ornamental that we see. Now, getting back here to Vernalis, which you mentioned earlier on as not being a suitable understock, this is a picture of a Vernalis. We washed the soil out of it. You can see the number of sprouts coming from on the base of the plant. And on each one of these sprouts, maybe hard for you to see, but there are little buds. And these little buds are all capable of producing side branches and new shoots. And sometimes when people see these sprouts on witch hazels, other plants actually coming up through the ground, they just cut them off at what would be the ground level. And when you cut them off at ground level, what you have done is now created a little peg or left a peg that's covered with little buds. In the next growing season, or perhaps the same year, these buds are going to pop into growth and they're creating an even thicker group of sprouts. And so really the only way to do this is to get down there with a knife or just peel it away and try to get down here to the bottom and excise this thing at the point of its origin. Get out there and excise it right there. Don't cut it off at any point higher than the point where it arose from. Because if you do that, you're going to generate a greater proliferation of suckers. Now, here's an example of a plant that, I don't know how it was cared for before, but it's obviously really starting to sucker a lot. And it illustrates not just the development of suckers from around the base of the plant, but the fact that Vernalis can create these suckers from the root system itself. And that's what makes Vernalis so undesirable. If we could just control it around the base, like we attempt to do with Virginiana and other plants that sucker close to the base, then we wouldn't have this problem. But we get it out here on the root system, and that really becomes a maintenance issue. So here's an example, and unfortunately, this was a Virginiana understock that is suckering out vigorously. In this particular case, this particular tree, this purchase I made was of a tree from a pallida, and the Virginiana that this particular grower used was some of the most aggressive as far as suckering that I've ever encountered with any Virginiana understock. And it suggests that somewhere down the road, somewhere in the United States, there's probably some provenances, some locales where the plants that are growing there would not have the same tendency to sucker vigorously. And as an industry, maybe it needs to be a master's thesis project for somebody. Get out there and do a range-wide survey of Hamamelis. Try to find something that's going to generate less suckers, maybe no suckers at all. But right now we don't have any such thing. Here's an example of a Vernalis understock. The blue ribbon is on the stem of the plant we were trying to propagate, or that we propagated and tried to grow on, and it died for whatever reason, and the Vernalis understock just took off. This is a sort of an extreme example of what a Vernalis can do. If it's in the landscape, it's going to be unmaintainable, and it's very undesirable. So it goes back again to the nursery. A nursery who knows that they shouldn't use Vernalis is being very unprofessional, very unethical, really, to produce anything that's on a Vernalis. If you don't know the difference, well, it's too bad for not learning more about your trade before you began the process of grafting these things, propagating them. But again, most of us now who are doing this realize you never use Vernalis just because it's so unsatisfactory. Yet even Virginiana can give us a problem, and we have to stay on top. So what is the alternative to grafting these things? And Brian Humphreys, thank you for sending in some questions before the program. Hopefully I'll answer those for you during the course of the program. But Carlton Nursery, now Bailey Nursery out in Oregon a few years ago, began to graft their witch hazels onto Rodia. And here you can see some understock. You can see understock back here. You can see back here. Here's a close-up of it. They were grafting their Rodia, and I believe I'm correct in saying that the ground grafts, the low ground grafts, the material grafted at ground level, they're doing that. And ones that they're grafting in the field as standards, and we saw that earlier, we'll see a standard again in the future slide, but the ones that they're grafting in the field did not generate as many suckers. The thought is that since the plant that's growing on the standard in the field has more energy above the ground, the root systems are not as inclined to produce suckering as much as when they're down low at the base of the plant, and the grafters right at the soil line. Harold Neubauer, again in Tennessee, told me that they used Rodia as an understock for Hamamelis for a period of time. And they found two negatives. One, it suckered to beat the band, far worse than the Virginia sources. And in addition, the plants themselves, the witch hazels themselves, were less vigorous. They didn't have the growth rate that they were getting out of the Virginian understock. So Neubauers have moved away from using Rodia as an understock, except on grafts that are of Rodia. So they're no longer using Rodia as an understock for witch hazels. So then why don't we raise them from cuttings? Most everything else today is done from cuttings. Here's what happened at our place. And I think many propagators who may be in the audience today can nod their heads and say they had the same problem. We can root witch hazels. They can be difficult, and the Vernalis types always seem to be better than any of the intermediate types. Therefore, maybe the tonic is in mollis would follow the same logic, but Vernalis root pretty well. And we can overwinter these things. This is in a 2¼ diameter pot. This is overwintered in a minimum heat house. What happened the following spring? It broke dormancy and it died. Remember, the very first witch hazel I was ever given was an Arnold Promise. Wayne Mezzett's propagator at Weston Nursery gave me a container of our own root witch hazel. I brought it home, and the next spring it died. That was my first experience with something that somebody gave me. And I find the same thing happening here. Root them, and the rooting process, some of them will die the first winter. Ones that don't die, we pot up into a bigger pot. We put them back into a minimum heat house again. And in the springtime, a great number of them are alive. They break dormancy, and a great number of them break dormancy and they die. So here I am now, 2 years after I started the cutting. I had losses in the cutting frame. I have losses in the 1-year plant. Now I'm losing them as a 2-year plant. My gosh, how much more of this can we take as commercial growers? But we take the ones that survive of the 2-year group, we put them into a bigger pot. And for a while, I figured these roots have got to be hardy enough to go. They've got to be durable enough to go into a poly house, wintered out of doors, under poly cover, but they aren't going to be in minimum heat anymore. That was bad thought, because in many cases, here we are now going to the third winter. What happened again? They died. Now, is there something I'm doing wrong? Maybe. Certainly could be cultural, it could be pathological, but there are enough growers say, we tried, we gave up. We just can't get over wintering successes that are commercially high enough to make it worth our time. So now I take these plants in their 3rd year, they go into a poly house, they get laid on their side for the winter, they get put under a frost blanket, some sort of winter protection, because by the 3rd year, they've got to be tough enough to not have to be babied anymore. But again, it's a tough cookie. So is there witch hazel being propagated by tissue culture? Perhaps some, not to any great extent. I don't know where I got this photograph. It might have been from Golden Arboretum, for all I know, maybe from Lowesley Nursery, don't recall. But I don't know of anybody who's actually producing commercial amounts of witch hazel STC. So things to consider from the propagation side. Firstly, if we get a plant that's been grown from cuttings, we get it out into the field. And if we take our cuttings from young cutting grown plants, there should be enhanced juvenility retained into that plant, and we should be able to have at least initial better rooting. The propagation frame, that may not change the percent of plants that die after the 1st year, but at least it may give us a greater number of surviving plants to attempt to go into the 1st year. Plants that are on their own roots could be put into stool beds. Certainly we see stool beds used in a lot of fruit tree production and apple production. I remember local nurseries were producing Orlis avellana contorta in stool beds. There's no reason why we couldn't do witch hazels, particularly the Vernalis types that generate a lot of sprouts from the bottom. It would be a good candidate to go into a stool. Another thing that we could do, and I did this once, I had a plant, Cohanky red it was, and it was on its own roots. It was in the field. It was a large plant. We bulbed and burlapped it. And after we dug it out, I noticed that there were a number of large roots remaining in the soil from where the ball had been lifted out of the soil. So I dug up those roots, those larger root pieces, and I put them in the fridge. Later, I went and got some branches of Cohanky red, and I, in essence, grafted the branch onto the roots of the same soil. I treated those, I calloused them up, I healed them, I potted them up, and they survived very well. So here I had a situation where I didn't have to worry about losing the plants as a wood cutting. I didn't have to worry about those 2 and 3 years after the fact of the roots not being mature enough to go out of doors, not hardy enough. And so, yes, grafting is expensive. Root grafting is, obviously, it's an extra step, but it was a way in this situation to get the plants to survive, and they were durable. The other aspect of grafting that I think could go into play here, and we've had some great papers in IPPS, one I recall by George Lease from Ontario, and George talked about if you are grafting and you avoid the hypocotyl, that area of transition between the true root system and the stem itself, you avoid that hypocotyl, and you go down and graft onto a piece of root of a compatible understock. Oftentimes, the plant that results from that will have no suckers. You will not have that issue of sucker problems. So I have grafted Malus onto roots, and I have grafted Tilia onto roots. And in both cases, I have never had any suckers develop by grafting that scion onto a compatible root. So why not, if we're bare root grafting our witch hazels? And again, when the seedlings come in, they're not always going to be potted. You actually can bare root graft, bench graft them. Take that plant and not take your graft and make it just above the soil line, or what would be the soil line, but cut the thing right off at the soil line, or cut it off at where the hypocotyl would be, and actually graft that scion onto the true root, and then pull that on. And once again, it's just another step in the grafting process, with an extra step to take. But I think that's a very viable alternative to dealing with the potential for all these understock. As far as diseases, witch hazels have their own complex of problems. Powdery mildew is one. In this particular example, a person might think, well, that silvery cast is a nice, attractive ornamental feature, but it's not. It's a mildew. It's a fungal disease. In this particular case, that plant, by the time autumn came around, still had those fungal, that sheen of that fungal growth on there. And the fact that this plant was a leaf retainer made it look even more nasty. But mildew is a problem. It can be a problem. A problem that we have is, the bigger problem is leaf anthracnose. Here we have anthracnose on Arnold Promise. Arnold Promise is, for me, one of the worst plants to have anthracnose issues. I know, again, Harold Neubauer has spoken down in Tennessee. They don't even grow Arnold Promise because it's so subject to leaf anthracnose issues. Another problem is a potential virus issue. I first read about this in a Gardener Chronicle magazine. I think Roy Lancaster wrote back in the 70s or the 80s, where he spoke about a probable virus cause of some distortion in Brevipedala. We see the same kind of distortion of leaves, the shorter inner nodes, occur not just in Brevipedala, but in Rochester and in Doriac. But those are the only three clones we see it in. And we never see it spread into anything else. We're not quite sure what that's all about. There's a weevil causing a fruit gall. It looks sort of like an ornament, but again, it's a gall. Maybe you English folk can recognize this fellow. When I visited Hilliers about in 1979, I stopped to see them doing some B&B work. Here's this young guy just finishing up one of the balls. Sort of is used to signify that most of the time witch hazels transplant very well as a large B&B landscape item. So at this point, I know we're like 5 or 10 minutes from the end of the program, and we're going to not do a full A to Z. We're just going to capture a few of the plants that that I like. And one of them is amethyst. Years ago, we had some seedlings, and we had 3 that were sort of lavender color. I was evaluating them, but somehow one of the plants found its way down to Don's Shadow in Tennessee, and Don said, I really like that plant. I'm going to call it amethyst. And he named it, and it became part of the trade. Amethyst has great fall color. A couple years ago now, Bob Marquardt, who was doing breeding work, research work at Holden Arboretum, went through the fields of local nurseries up here to see what kind of diversity he would find in the flowering plants of Virginiana. They should have been flowering in that November, December period. He went through and he found, much to his surprise, a Vernalis in full bloom in the autumn. He was quite surprised by that. He bought the plant or took it back to Holden. Chris Lane eventually named that plant Holden. So here we have a plant that's out of character. What makes it unique? It's a Vernalis. Instead of being a spring bloomer, it's a fall bloomer. So what happened with Holden? Well, Marquardt reached back into amethyst, lavender. He crossed the 2 of those. So we had a Vernalis plant crossed into a Vernalis hybrid. We don't know what amethyst's true parent is, but it's part Vernalis. And from that, he created a plant that I eventually named Beholden. What makes Beholden exciting is that it's red, it flowers at Christmas. It actually starts before Christmas, still in bloom at Christmas as a rule. And in our climate, again, looking at what witch hazels typically do, we have no witch hazels that bloom in the middle of the year. We have the early ones, we have the spring ones, we have nothing in the middle. So Beholden isn't the most outrageous as far as flower, color, or form. It has very clean, dark green leaves. It's great. The northeastern landscape, for sure, this is a plant that's going to have a definite niche because it does something that no other witch hazel does. And now we're going to skim through a number of cultivars that we can finish on time. Anton Court, named after the nurseryman who preceded Arboretum Compound. Aphrodite, a lovely, lovely burnt orange color that is very, very fragrant. Sometimes it's a little bit intermittent in its flowering. Not every year is quite as profuse as the one before. Arnold Promise, again, going back to sort of the namesake of this program. Here's a plant grafted on a Rodia stem, showing that eventually, I guess the goal would be to have that attractive Rodia bark, that winter character, as well as the flower. Very fragrant, very vase shape. Again, this plant showing the autumn color illustrates again the overall habit of the plant is very. Aurora, a wonderful plant that we like very, very much. It can retain its leaves in some years, but some of the better traits are that it has some of the longest flower petals of any, and it's got a extremely delicate, very sweet scent. Absolutely one of our favorite plants for fragrance. It's our top 5. Farmstead Gold, a great German selection, very, very bold, very dark color, a very good commercial plant. Bernstein, a similar plant to Barmstead Gold, but it's not a dead ringer by any means. This suggests to me, I want to comment on something that we have so many plants that are similar plants. And I've coined the word similars. When you have 2 plants that are functionally the same thing, and they're interchangeable for that reason. Yes, they're cultivars of record, but I like to think of them as similars. There's quite a few similars with some of these flowering groups of which Bernstein isn't necessarily a similar of Barnstead Gold, but Bear gets another strong color that came out of Belgium. Carmen Red, an old cultivar, not seen too much anymore, but it's an established one. Chris, named after Chris Saunders, and Chris Lane, both of those gentlemen, the enthusiasts who are often over to Camped Out, and so the people that Camped Out have named one of their seedlings after the 2 Chris's. Maybe this should be called Chris's. Diane, an old plant. It came out of the old, I think this is one of the plants that was selected out of Camped Out from Anton Court's time. It probably represents the red that we typically find here in the United States. When a person goes to a store to buy witch hazels, they're typically going to only find 3 if they find any at all. Arnold Promise for the yellow, they're going to find Diane for the red, and they're going to find Yelena for the orange. And Diane is a powerful color. It's a good plant. The problem with Diane can be that if it's a dry, hot spring, not a cool spring, the plants will fade into a copper. They don't stay the intense. Glowing Embers, David Leach brought this plant in from Japan a few years ago. It was mislabeled. Chris Lane sorted it out and realized what it wasn't, and he coined the name Glowing Embers. It's very broad, very flat growing plant, very long, very sort of luscious petals, but its habit is quite flat. Berry, another plant out of the Camped Out collection, great plant. Hiltonberry came from, I think, the Hillier Nursery, great for fall color. It has red flowers, not commonly grown, but it's good for fall color. I have this plant labeled Yelena, and I don't know if I'm correct or not because I know in Chris's book he states that the original plant had died. So this may not be Yelena in the background, but it's Chris Lane in the foreground, Chris Saunders in the background, Harry Van Trier, the curator at Camped Out at the time, leading us through the garden, showing though the scale of some of these older plants. Yelena has great fall color. My plants are just starting to bloom today. This is how they're beginning to look, though this is not at my place. This is how they're looking today. And there's the flower. So this is a great, great plant. There's nothing wrong with anybody going only this selection. It's a great one. Livia, I saw this at Heimelreich. It certainly was the strongest, clearest red of any that I had seen up to that point. For me, it's been very subject to anthracnose, and my older plants perished. I have to repropagate it again. Moonlight and basically, you don't get them all, but it's an old one you'll find in some of the older gardens. A late seedling. In our own hybridizing here, which was basically just casual, we just collected the seed and sowed it. We found a plant that was sterile, it has multiple petals, it doesn't have any stamens. It basically is non-fruiting because it's almost sterile both ways, but it's extremely late. And here it is flowering with Cornus flora. Very, very late in the spring. The latest of all is another seedling that we developed here called Orange Encore. This is a big tree. My oldest plant's about 15 feet high. This color is rather outrageous component in the spring because there are no orange flowered spring blooming plants in our environment. So this plant is really showy. The problem is it's so late that I think if you get into the southern states where you're not going to have enough vernalization, cold hours, pain, it's going to flower very late and maybe very sporadically when it does. This is more for the northern climate. Orange Peel, another one out of the builders. Pallida, an old favorite. And again, this photograph is important because it shows the habit of witch hazels, habit in the sense of structure. Pallida is a flat top plant. Here's Chris Lane photographing it. Here's my wife and Martin Ricks at Kew looking at Pallida. Again, the trunk's way over here someplace. This is a very flat top plant. And most, I think, Americans have no clue that when they buy a witch hazel and they buy a Pallida, that they're actually looking for something that's not going to be like an Arnold Promise, tall and vase-shaped, very low and flat. And the fall color on Pallida is yellow. Primavera, this is the original Primavera. Again, it comped out a great, very bold lemon yellow. It's not very fragrant though, so that's the downside of it, but it's a great plant, very ornamental. Rochester from the Rochester Parks. This is absolutely the most fragrant witch hazel of anything we've ever produced. The negative is it's a leaf retainer, it can mildew, and it can get the virus and have the kind of stunted growth pattern. But this is a plant that when it comes down to fragrance, it's early as well. It's just overpoweringly strong. Reuben, bit of a bicolor red, good strong color. Ruby Glow, here taken at Wisley Gardens. This is another old plant that came out of camped out. I think it's one of quartz seedlings, I think. It's been replaced pretty much by Diane, but it's a plant of good merit on it. Great colors left. This one came in out of Japan. Don Shadow brought this in. If there's any plant that's going to bump Diane out of her position of prominence as the red of choice, it may be this one. The red is almost neon colored. Well, this is some fusion of blue in the background here. This one here is undoubtedly a contender. The flowers are bigger than Diane. They're flatter. They're broader than Diane. The color is very different than Diane. It's not a clear red, but this one doesn't fade into something else. It pretty well holds color saturation appropriately. So I think Shibamishi Red has a Japanese name, which I won't try to say, but I think Shibamishi Red is going to be a strong player unless something else befalls, like perhaps the anthracnose disease. Twilight, another good bicolor, work with. Vesna, one from Madame de Velde, another great choice. Westerstedt, I sort of think of this as a German equivalent to Arnold Promise because it flowers late. The flowers are attractive, they're fragrant, the habit is base shape, but again, very, very sensitive here to anthracnose. And then perhaps its own story. Chris Lane, Chris Saunders, I think, upon this after some devastating storm events at Wisley Gardens, they found this mollis type of flowering. For us, it is totally perfect commercial plant. It's floriferous, it's fragrant. It's doesn't always have its leaf retention perfectly balanced right, but it's early and it has great growth characteristics. And I think this plant will be in any commercial top 5 or top 10. For me, it can flower at Christmas. I looked at it today. It's just beginning to open today, so it's later than, let's say, Boscoop, Early Bright, and Fred Chittenden, which are coming into bloom today. But this is a great choice. Carol Neubauer has told me this will flower before the end of the year. So more things to consider as we wrap this up. Let's recreate the intermediate cross again using superior forms of each species. Let's look at Vernalis to increase reliability, or excuse me, rootability, perhaps hardiness and heat tolerance. Being a southern species, will it have heat tolerance? Let's collect superior forms of Ovalis from the full range and have fun hybridizing these amongst themselves and with these other species. Let's identify provenances of Virginiana that have less tendencies to suffer. And let's go out and enjoy their unrivaled beauty. And as I know my wife will be doing very soon as we get into those kind of days when it's crisp outside, but the sun is bright, witch hazels are all popping, I know we're going to get out there and enjoy them together. We're celebrating our anniversary, almost the 40th year of marriage, and the fact that witch hazels are announcing the spring is almost. What did Arnold promise? Perhaps a lot of things to me, and I hope a lot of things to you. So where will we go to see witch hazels? Golly, here in the United States, we have some amazing collections developing. Brookside Gardens in Maryland, the Dawes Arboretum in Newark, Ohio, Green Springs Gardens in Alexandria, Virginia, Seacrest Arboretum in Worcester, Ohio, the Weggers in Metro Park in Dayton, Ohio. And of course, if you're over in Europe, you've got Arboretum Comped Out, which is having a banner year, I'm told, and the Witch Hazel Nursery in Kent, England, where Chris Lane holds the national collection. So these are the places to go if you get a chance. For us here in the Northeast, it's just beginning. Get out there and enjoy them.